November 11th, 1943. The morning air above Rabaul was thick with the smell of salt and diesel, a lingering haze from the volcanic soils that clung to the jungle like a shroud. Captain Masahiro Tanaka, commander of the Japanese 31st Army's forward garrison, stood on the observation deck of his headquarters, binoculars pressed to his eyes. Beyond the dense green canopy, the harbour pulsed with life, cargo ships being loaded with rice, munitions, and reinforcements, patrol boats skimming the water's edge, aircraft taxiing across makeshift runways. For months, Tanaka had trusted in the doctrine that had guided the Imperial Japanese Army through the early years of the Pacific War. Hold every island at all costs, build fortifications, stockpile ammunition, and trust in mobility and morale to resist the Americans' slow but inevitable advance. Yet, even as he scanned the horizon, a quiet unease pressed against him, not from enemy fire, but from whispers of a new American strategy spreading through intercepted communications and fragmented intelligence reports. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. These reports hinted at a concept so audacious, so counterintuitive, that it seemed almost impossible. The United States would bypass heavily fortified positions entirely, isolating them with a ring of air and naval power rather than engaging directly. A leapfrog approach, they called it. And if it succeeded, Tanaka's 35,000 men would be cut off from reinforcements and resupply, left to wither in the suffocating jungles of New Britain, while the Allies moved unopposed toward strategic objectives. The irony was immediate and bitter. Japan had built Rabaul into a fortress that even the Allies' heaviest bombardments had failed to crack. Guns bristled along ridges, concrete bunkers dotted the coastlines, and tunnels snaked beneath hillsides capable of sheltering thousands. Supplies were stockpiled with painstaking calculation. Rice measured in drums, ammunition tallied per gun, medical stores catalogued to the last morphine ampule. The Japanese commanders had expected direct assaults, pitched battles where bravery and discipline would determine the outcome. And now, in the space of a few intercepted messages and cautious reconnaissance flights, that entire worldview was being challenged not by superior firepower, but by a form of warfare that relied on patience, cunning, and attrition at a distance. By November, Allied forces had already demonstrated the lethal efficiency of their approach. The invasions of Tarawa and Makin in the Gilbert Islands had revealed a capacity for precise, coordinated amphibious operations, but in the Solomons, where American forces had established beachheads at Guadalcanal and Bougainville, Japanese officers observed a new pattern. Rather than attacking every fortified position, the Americans seemed to measure strategic value over symbolic possession, choosing targets that would maximize operational mobility while minimizing costly frontal engagements. For Tanaka, this meant that the massive stockpiles of supplies and reinforcements in Rabaul, everything he and his predecessors had calculated with painstaking care, might never see the battlefield in the way they intended. The psychological shock of this realization weighed heavily on Japanese officers. Lieutenant Colonel Hiroshi Saito, in charge of artillery coordination across the northern perimeter, later recalled in interrogations after the war, "We had always assumed that an army could be defeated only through attrition in battle or by overwhelming force. The Americans proved that it could be done simply by ignoring us, by moving around us, and by cutting us off without ever firing a shot at the main garrison. We felt like ghosts in our own fortress, watched but untouched, powerful yet impotent." The foundation of this belief, and its eventual collapse, can be traced to Japan's operational doctrine at the time. The Imperial Japanese Army had emphasized the principle of Ichijo no shori, or decisive victory, the expectation that battles would be resolved through courage, discipline, and the judicious use of limited resources. Logistics were always a constraining factor. The Japanese calculated that ammunition, rations, and medical supplies would allow only a finite duration of sustained operations. A destroyer might carry precisely 2,000 rounds of 5-inch shells, A battalion might be allotted exactly 60 days of rice and protein concentrate. Every calculation was an exercise in conservative resource management, reflecting a culture that prioritized restraint and precision. In the Americas, by contrast, the sheer industrial output of the United States meant that Allied commanders could adopt entirely different principles. Quantity could substitute for precision, and operational art could outpace tactical tradition. The Japanese would soon discover that their entire logic for defense had been made irrelevant. The first indications arrived in December, as Allied reconnaissance flights mapped the Northern Solomons and New Britain. Intelligence reports noted the landing of Marines at Cape Gloucester, then at Araway, positions chosen not for their intrinsic value, but for their ability to sever Japanese lines of communication and resupply. For Tanaka, who had trained his men to anticipate direct attacks on the harbour, the strategy was surreal. Instead of storming Rabaul head-on, the Americans were advancing along an axis that circumvented the fortress entirely, isolating Japanese forces in a vast, lethal trap of their own making. By mid-December, the reality of isolation became tangible. Supply ships attempting to reach Rabaul were intercepted or rerouted, and air superiority achieved by the Allies meant that resupply by sea was increasingly hazardous. Japanese garrisons found themselves rationing not out of prudence but necessity. Rice drums, meant to last 60 days, now stretched to 90. Medical supplies were allocated with ruthless prioritization. Fuel for trucks and artillery became scarce, forcing the abandonment of vehicles and guns that had been painstakingly positioned for defense. Officers recorded their bewilderment and frustration, often noting in logs and diaries the profound disparity between the fortress they had built and the reality they now faced. One of the most striking aspects of the Leapfrog strategy was its reliance not merely on avoidance but on psychological attrition. Japanese troops, trained to measure success in terms of resistance and tactical engagement, found themselves cut off, yet unassailed. Captain Tanaka wrote in a private memo, "We are besieged not by bombs or bullets, but by absence. The Americans move through the islands like shadows, and we are left to watch them pass, powerless, as if our guns and men exist only in memory." For men trained to act decisively, to resist boldly, the experience was disorienting. Supply calculations, artillery positions, and even morale, the very pillars of military confidence, were rendered irrelevant. In this period, the Japanese began to confront the cruel arithmetic of industrial warfare, a lesson that had echoed across the Pacific from Coral Sea to Guadalcanal. Just as American ships could unleash barrages that exhausted Japanese destroyers' entire ammunition reserves in minutes, so too could strategic mobility render months of careful provisioning meaningless. Rabaul, intended to anchor Japanese control of the Bismarck archipelago, became a gilded cage. The very strength that had been meticulously calculated, the massive garrison, the network of fortifications, the depth of logistical planning, was transformed into a liability when confronted with a strategy that did not engage it directly. By January 1944, the Leapfrog approach had begun to bear fruit. Allied forces landed on Cape Gloucester on the western tip of New Britain, then at Talisea, securing airfields and positions that would allow them to project power deeper into the archipelago. Japanese patrols reported an eerie lack of engagement. American forces did not attack Rabaul itself. Instead, they built an invisible perimeter, a noose of operational control that severed communications and resupply routes. The Japanese garrison, now numbering over 135,000 troops across New Britain and surrounding islands, faced a stark choice: attempt to break out at massive risk, or hunker down and await the slow suffocation of their resources. Captain Tanaka's reflections from this period reveal the psychological transformation induced by the strategy. He later wrote, in a memoir captured in post-war interrogations, "We had believed in the invincibility of fortification, in the power of calculated defense. Yet the Americans never tested us directly. They moved like water, around and through the gaps in our understanding, and we were left to measure defeat in days of dwindling rations rather than hours of combat." This was the collision of belief and reality, a moment when doctrine met the immutable truth of strategic innovation industrial capacity, and psychological warfare. By mid-January 1944, the encirclement of Rabaul had become more than a theory. It was a living, breathing reality. Allied reconnaissance planes frequently flew over the harbour, and each overflight provided another stark confirmation that Japanese supplies were finite. Every ton of rice, every drum of fuel, every crate of ammunition was now measured against the cruel calculus of isolation. For the Japanese commanders, the irony was excruciating. They had constructed what was considered the most formidable fortress in the South Pacific, yet their numerical and positional superiority was rendered irrelevant by an enemy who refused to engage directly. The logistical challenges were immediate and severe. The Imperial Japanese Navy attempted to run the so-called Tokyo Express, high-speed destroyer missions meant to resupply garrisons in the Solomons and New Britain. Each run was a perilous gamble. In December 1943 alone, Rear Admiral Masahiro Tanaka led 8 destroyers in a mission to deliver ammunition and medical supplies to forward positions around Rabaul. The cargo manifest reads like a testament to desperation. 1,100 drums of rice, 200 drums of medical supplies, and only 280 drums of ammunition for an entire garrison of over 135,000 men. Each drum contained roughly 300 rounds, or their equivalent in smaller arms munitions. In practical terms, the entire effort supplied less than what a single American destroyer could expend in 20 minutes of target practice. The arithmetic of isolation became painfully clear to officers on the ground. Lieutenant Colonel Saito, responsible for coordinating artillery along the northern ridges, wrote in his diary on January 17th, "We ration our shells as we ration our rice, counting each round as if it were a coin of life. The enemy does not need to fight us directly, they need only to starve us of opportunity, and our fortress becomes our prison." The Japanese had trained for attritional warfare fighting to the last man, last round, but the Americans had invented a form of attrition that bypassed combat entirely. Supplies, mobility, and operational flexibility, once the foundation of Japanese confidence, were now the instruments of their isolation. The geography of New Britain magnified the effects of this strategy. Rabaul itself was situated on the northeastern tip of the island, surrounded by dense jungle, mangrove swamps, and volcanic ridges. Roads were few, and those that existed were subject to destruction by air raids or artillery strikes. Every inland movement required careful planning, fuel management, and time luxuries the Japanese could no longer afford. When American forces established positions at Cape Gloucester and Araway, they effectively severed the overland routes and prevented the movement of reinforcements. Aircraft based at these captured airfields could interdict resupply convoys, forcing the Japanese to rely on limited naval transport. Even then, air superiority meant that any ship attempting to approach Rabaul risked destruction. The human toll was immediate. Soldiers accustomed to calculated rations found their daily allowances halved. Rice, the staple of the Japanese diet, was now strictly portioned, a half cup per man at each meal, supplemented by dried fish or beans when available. Fresh water became a precious commodity, collected from rain and stored in makeshift cisterns. Medical supplies, already limited, were stretched to the breaking point. Morphine, antiseptics, and surgical implements were allocated sparingly, with field surgeons forced to improvise with rudimentary tools. Tropical diseases, malaria, dysentery, and dengue fever began to claim more lives than the American bombardments ever could have. In diaries later recovered by Allied forces, officers recorded the psychological strain, "Our men sleep in the shadows of our own fortifications, yet every day feels like the first of a siege that will never end." Despite these conditions, Japanese command maintained its doctrine of fortitude. Officers like Captain Tanaka and Lieutenant Colonel Saito insisted that every gun remain manned, every observation post staffed, and every defensive position maintained. Artillery batteries continued to fire limited patrol rounds, largely for training and morale purposes, but never at advancing American forces, for there were none directly threatening the fortress. Ammunition consumption was meticulously calculated, yet each calculation now underscored futility. Even at maximum sustainable rates, the supplies would not last more than a few months if the isolation continued. Meanwhile, the Americans executed their Leapfrog operations with a blend of audacity and precision. At Cape Gloucester, engineers and combat troops rapidly constructed airfields capable of supporting fighter and medium bomber operations. From these positions, they could project air power across the northern tip of New Britain, dominating the approaches to Rabaul without ever having to mount a direct assault. At Araway, a small coastal landing allowed the establishment of forward naval bases, facilitating patrols that intercepted any Japanese attempts at resupply. The American strategy emphasized mobility and selective engagement. Only positions that threatened operational objectives were attacked, while heavily fortified positions like Rabaul were bypassed, isolated, and rendered strategically irrelevant. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The effect on Japanese psychology cannot be overstated. For decades, imperial doctrine had equated strength with presence. The occupation of a position signified control and power. Now, the fortress that symbolized Japanese resolve became a monument to impotence. Officers recorded frustration in their logs. Entire divisions were unable to advance, resupply, or even adequately maintain morale, yet they could do nothing to change the course of the campaign. "We fire at shadows of the past," Lieutenant Colonel Saito noted, "while the enemy moves unseen, unchallenged, and we are reduced to counting days and drums of rice." The isolation of Rabaul also had profound operational consequences. Japanese field intelligence became increasingly unreliable as radio communications were disrupted or intercepted. Resupply missions faced continuous attrition, not through combat alone, but through the logistical impossibility imposed by American control of the surrounding islands and waters. Japanese planners had meticulously calculated the capacity of Rabaul's harbour, the range of artillery, and the sustainability of the garrison under siege conditions. Yet none of these calculations accounted for a strategic approach that rendered the fortress operationally irrelevant without a single frontal assault. By February 1944, disease and starvation were beginning to outpace the limited combat casualties. The garrison reported that malaria alone incapacitated thousands of men, reducing combat-ready forces by over 20% in some sectors. Malnutrition compounded these effects. Soldiers and labourers began to suffer from scurvy and beriberi as rations ran low. Medical officers improvised, prescribing medicinal herbs and makeshift treatments, but supplies of quinine, bandages, and surgical equipment were increasingly scarce. Officers recorded the toll in blunt numerical terms. Of the 35,000 men in forward positions around Rabaul, fewer than 25,000 were considered fully effective. Japanese attempts to adapt were constrained by doctrine and geography. Troops could not disperse freely due to the challenging terrain, and the culture of obedience limited improvisation beyond prescribed orders. Artillery batteries, carefully positioned to defend key approaches, were unable to engage an enemy that refused to present itself directly. Supply calculations, which had guided Japanese planning for months, now highlighted the futility of preparation. Even if all remaining supplies were mobilized, they could not sustain the garrison for more than a few months. In essence, Rabaul had become a giant trap, a fortress too strong to assault but too isolated to escape. One particularly revealing moment occurred in late February, during a reconnaissance flight over Cape Gloucester. Japanese observers reported American engineers constructing a series of artillery emplacements and airstrips in positions that had been considered secure under previous Japanese assumptions. The observers noted with growing alarm that the Americans were not building these positions for immediate attack on Rabaul, but to dominate the approaches, to sever supply lines, and to enforce a perimeter that the garrison could not penetrate. The Americans were not trying to destroy Rabaul, they were neutralizing it, achieving strategic victory without ever risking a direct engagement. The psychological impact of this realization was profound. Captain Tanaka wrote in his personal log, "We are surrounded not by men, but by a system. Our cannons may be pointed outward, yet the noose tightens with every day, and there is no enemy to fire upon. Our fortress, our pride, our calculations, they have all been rendered irrelevant by patience, movement, and numbers beyond our comprehension. For men trained to measure power by the ability to engage, the concept of being defeated by inaction, by bypass and isolation was difficult to comprehend. By March 1944, the full consequences of the Leapfrog strategy were undeniable. Rabaul's garrison was effectively trapped. Supply convoys were limited to night runs under constant threat from air patrols, and the few that succeeded were able to deliver only a fraction of the necessities for over 135,000 troops. Disease, malnutrition, and exhaustion were steadily eroding the fighting capability of the defenders. Meanwhile, the Americans continued to advance through the northern Solomons and onto western New Britain, establishing airfields, naval bases, and supply points that ensured control of the operational perimeter without ever touching the heavily fortified Rabaul itself. The contrast between expectation and reality crystallized a fundamental truth. The war was no longer only a matter of courage, fortifications, or tactical skill. Industrial capacity, operational mobility, and innovative strategy dictated outcomes more decisively than the meticulous planning of garrisons or the bravery of individual units. The Japanese had anticipated a war of direct confrontation and decisive battles. The Americans waged a war of strategic envelopment and operational patience, demonstrating that the mastery of movement and attrition could render even the strongest fortress irrelevant. By April 1944, the siege of Rabaul had shifted from operational concern to existential reality. The garrison, numbering over 135,000, faced the slow attrition of isolation. Food stocks dwindled to critical levels. Rice rations, once measured in generous half-cup servings, had been reduced to a quarter cup per meal in many units. Fresh protein was nearly non-existent. Dried fish and beans were stretched across weeks. Medical supplies were all but exhausted. Morphine, quinine, antiseptics, and bandages were carefully inventoried and distributed only to those whose survival was deemed critical to the defense of the fortress. Each officer maintained meticulous logs of consumption, knowing that these records might be the last trace of operational capability the garrison would ever produce. Disease had become the invisible enemy. Malaria, dysentery, and tropical ulcers claimed hundreds of men each week. Lieutenant Colonel Hiroshi Saito, commanding artillery units along Rabaul's northern ridges, recorded in his diary that one battery of 70 men had been reduced to 35 effective soldiers in less than 6 weeks. "We are not defeated by bombs or bullets," he wrote, "but by the simple fact that life cannot be sustained without nourishment, water, and medicine. And these have been denied to us, not by our enemies' courage, but by their foresight and patience." Air power cemented the isolation. Allied aircraft launched relentless strikes on shipping, attempting to run supplies into Rabaul, while fighter patrols over the island itself made daytime movement almost impossible. Any attempt to evacuate wounded or reinforce positions was fraught with danger. The Imperial Japanese Navy, already stretched thin across the Solomons and New Guinea, could provide only sporadic resupply runs. Even the legendary Tokyo Express, which had once enabled daring nocturnal resupply missions, now struggled under constant aerial threat. Each destroyer sent to the harbour risked not just its own loss, but the near-certain death of its crew and the futility of the supplies it carried. Despite these hardships, the Japanese maintained the outward appearance of order. Gun batteries remained manned, observation posts were staffed, patrols continued in the surrounding jungle. The soldiers clung to doctrine, trained to fight to the last man and defend every position. Yet the truth of their predicament was impossible to deny. Units trained for combat found themselves immobilized by a strategy that emphasized avoidance rather than assault. Each day brought not enemy engagement, but the quiet gnawing of hunger, disease, and despair. American commanders had calculated this outcome with precision. The Leapfrog strategy had never required a frontal assault on Rabaul, and the fortress was no longer a military threat. By bypassing the stronghold and seizing peripheral islands and key airfields, the Allies created a strategic perimeter that allowed them to project power across New Britain without exposing troops to the heavy fortifications of Rabaul. Supply lines were secured, air superiority was established, and naval patrols ensured that Japanese reinforcements or evacuations were impossible. In essence, Rabaul had become a prison without walls, a fortress neutralized not by firepower but by operational ingenuity. The consequences of this isolation became starkly evident in the spring of 1944. Commanders at Rabaul observed the attrition of their troops, noting the rapid decline in effectiveness across multiple units. Artillery batteries could no longer sustain prolonged operations due to ammunition scarcity. Machine gun positions were left unmanned as crews fell ill or weakened from hunger. Engineers, tasked with maintaining fortifications and constructing defensive obstacles, were forced to prioritize survival over labor-intensive projects. Even communication networks within the garrison were strained as couriers and radio operators succumbed to disease or exhaustion. Captain Masahiro Tanaka, who had once surveyed Rabaul with confidence, came to understand the strategic brilliance of the American approach. He later reflected during post-war interrogations, "We had believed that strength was measured by what we occupied, by the size of our guns, and the number of men under our command. The Americans taught us a different lesson. They did not seek to destroy Rabaul, they sought to render it irrelevant. Our fortress became our prison, and our strength, our men, our supplies, our fortifications served only to demonstrate how thoroughly we had been outmaneuvered." The psychological impact on the troops was profound. Soldiers trained to measure courage and loyalty by engagement with the enemy were forced into inaction. There was no battle to win, no objective to reclaim. Instead, each day became a test of endurance, of the ability to subsist under increasingly desperate conditions. Officers recorded in their diaries a disorienting sense of impotence. Lieutenant Colonel Saito wrote, "Our men awaken each day, ready to fight, yet the fight never comes. We are powerful, yet powerless, armed, yet constrained by the absence of necessity. The Americans move past us as if we were shadows, and we exist only to watch them pass." The material effects were equally harrowing. Food shortages meant that foraging parties were dispatched into the jungle, often falling prey to disease or ambush. Water collection depended on rain and improvised cisterns, with contamination a constant risk. Medical treatment became a triage of impossibility. Wounds that might have been survivable in better circumstances now proved fatal. By mid-year, thousands of soldiers were incapacitated not by combat, but by the harsh calculus of isolation. From the American perspective, the success of the Leapfrog strategy at Rabaul was a textbook demonstration of operational art. By controlling key positions around the fortress, they ensured air and sea dominance without risking troops in costly direct assaults. The capture of peripheral islands and airfields allowed the Allies to support subsequent operations across New Guinea and the Bismarck archipelago. Rabaul, once considered a linchpin of Japanese defensive strategy in the South Pacific, was effectively neutralized, a fortress that existed more as a symbol than a functional military asset. The Japanese High Command, while aware of the unfolding disaster, was limited in options. Attempts to reinforce Rabaul were continually thwarted by American control of surrounding waters and airspace. Evacuation plans were considered but proved logistically impossible, given the numbers involved and the risk to naval assets. Officers were forced to reconcile with the strategic reality that one of the most formidable garrisons in the Pacific was now strategically obsolete. Despite these constraints, the Japanese garrison maintained discipline, reflecting the enduring ethos of the Imperial Army. Men continued to man posts, maintain fortifications, and conduct patrols. Commanders upheld morale as best they could, issuing rations, rotating duties, and encouraging small victories in training exercises. Yet the broader context, over 135,000 troops effectively rendered impotent, was undeniable. The fortress of Rabaul had become a monument to strategic futility, a testament to the consequences of underestimating industrial capacity, operational ingenuity, and psychological warfare. By late 1944, the operational impact of Rabaul's isolation extended beyond the island itself. Japanese supply lines across New Guinea and the Northern Solomons were increasingly vulnerable. The inability to project power from Rabaul allowed American forces to consolidate gains, establish new airfields, and plan subsequent operations for the invasion of the Philippines. Strategically, Rabaul's neutralization freed American forces to concentrate elsewhere, demonstrating the multiplier effect of bypassing heavily fortified positions rather than engaging them directly. The human consequences persisted into 1945. Even as the war drew to its final phases, Rabaul remained isolated. Troops who had survived months of rationing, disease, and exhaustion found their strength sapped further by the monotony and psychological strain of containment. Officers who had spent decades training for decisive engagement were confronted with the existential frustration of preparing for battles that never occurred. The fortress, once a symbol of Japanese strategic ingenuity and pride, had become a cage secure in structure but irrelevant in action. Post-war analyses underscore the profound lessons of the Rabaul campaign. American operational planners recognized that the success of the Leapfrog strategy was not simply a matter of firepower, but of mobility, industrial capacity, and psychological impact. By choosing which positions to engage and which to bypass, they forced Japanese forces into a defensive posture without costly direct assaults. The isolation of Rabaul demonstrated that even the most formidable fortifications could be rendered strategically irrelevant through superior operational art. For Japanese officers, the campaign became a case study in the limits of doctrine when confronted with industrialized, adaptive warfare. Captain Tanaka, reflecting years later, noted, "We believed in the certainty of fortification, in the arithmetic of supply and manpower, in the courage of our men. Yet all these truths were rendered meaningless by an enemy who measured success in movement and isolation, not in bullets or bombs. The lesson was bitter but absolute. Strategy can defeat strength without a fight." In retrospect, the campaign illustrates the intersection of human psychology and military innovation. Soldiers trained for engagement, commanders trained for decisive battle, and a fortress designed for endurance were all confronted with a reality that invalidated their assumptions. The Leapfrog strategy leveraged industrial capacity, air and naval superiority, and careful selection of objectives to achieve outcomes that conventional doctrine could neither anticipate nor counter. Rabaul's isolation also demonstrated the cascading consequences of strategic bypass. While the garrison remained intact, it was functionally neutralized, unable to project power, unable to receive reinforcements, and unable to influence operations beyond its immediate perimeter. The Allies' ability to apply pressure without direct engagement forced Japanese commanders to confront the limits of traditional doctrine and to reckon with the psychological and material realities of industrialized warfare. Ultimately, the fallacy of fortification in the absence of mobility and supply became one of the enduring lessons of the Pacific War. Rabaul, for all its formidable guns, concrete bunkers, and disciplined troops, could not overcome the strategic logic of leapfrogging, a logic rooted in patience, mobility, and the relentless application of resources where they mattered most. The fortress, like many symbols of Japanese strength, became a monument not to victory, but to the profound consequences of strategic miscalculation. As the war drew to its conclusion, Japanese soldiers in Rabaul subsisted on meager rations, endured rampant disease, and witnessed the steady advance of Allied forces elsewhere in the Pacific. Their diaries and post-war interrogations serve as stark testimony to the human and operational cost of being isolated by strategy rather than destroyed in combat. For Captain Masahiro Tanaka, Lieutenant Colonel Saito, and countless other officers, the experience of Rabaul represented both a personal and institutional reckoning, the recognition that skill, courage, and fortification, while necessary, were insufficient in the face of adaptive, resource-rich, and patient adversaries. The story of Rabaul's isolation underscores a fundamental truth of modern warfare. Strategic superiority is not measured solely in guns, men, or fortifications, but in the ability to shape the battlefield, control lines of communication, and impose one's operational logic on the enemy. The fortress that could not be taken by assault was rendered irrelevant by the quiet, inexorable power of strategic bypass, a lesson as stark and enduring as the jungle-covered ridges and tunnels that remain today as monuments to both ingenuity and futility. By the summer of 1945, Rabaul had ceased to matter in any operational sense. The fortress, once deemed the keystone of Japanese control in the South Pacific, stood largely intact, its concrete bunkers, artillery emplacements, and network of tunnels preserved, but it no longer influenced the course of the war. The 135,000 men trapped within its perimeter were effectively prisoners of strategy rather than casualties of combat. Disease, starvation, and isolation had become the dominant adversaries, not American shells or bombs. The irony was inescapable. The greatest Japanese stronghold in the theater was neutralized without ever being directly assaulted. The psychological toll on the garrison was profound and enduring. Generations of soldiers and officers had been trained to equate honor with action, courage with engagement, and strength with the ability to confront and defeat the enemy. Now they found themselves idle, confined, and helpless, not by a superior enemy force in direct combat, but by a strategy that bypassed their positions entirely. Diaries recovered after the war tell of officers pacing in tunnels, writing endless reports that would never be read, and men counting each grain of rice or drop of water as if life itself depended on arithmetic. Lieutenant Colonel Hiroshi Saito wrote in his final log, "We live as if under a spell. Every day, the enemy moves around us, not through us. We wait, we count, we endure, and the world we were meant to shape passes silently beyond our reach." From a logistical perspective, the Rabaul campaign highlighted the limits of fortification when confronted with industrial and operational superiority. Japanese planners had devoted years, enormous resources, and tens of thousands of personnel to constructing a fortress capable of withstanding prolonged siege or direct assault. The harbour could accommodate dozens of warships, the ridges were lined with artillery, and defensive positions were designed to repel landing parties with lethal efficiency. Yet all this preparation was rendered strategically irrelevant because the Americans had mastered mobility, selective engagement, and the exploitation of operational gaps. By controlling the surrounding islands, establishing airfields, and projecting naval power across the approaches to Rabaul, they imposed a siege without fighting, a demonstration that warfare is as much about maneuver and perception as it is about bullets and bombs. The consequences of this isolation were compounded by human factors. Food shortages forced extreme rationing. Soldiers subsisted on a quarter cup of rice per meal, supplemented by sparse beans or dried fish. Fresh water was collected from rain, stored in rudimentary cisterns, and shared with strict discipline. Malaria, dengue fever, dysentery, and other tropical diseases incapacitated thousands of men, reducing combat effectiveness across units by 20 to 40%. Medical supplies were critically scarce. Morphine, bandages, and antiseptics were rationed according to strict priority, while field surgeons improvised treatments with whatever materials were at hand. Even minor wounds could become fatal under these conditions, as infection ran unchecked. Despite these hardships, the garrison maintained remarkable discipline and cohesion. Officers rotated duties, organized labor parties, and enforced sanitation protocols to preserve morale and operational capacity. Artillery batteries fired limited patrol rounds, largely symbolic, to maintain readiness and discipline. Observation posts remained staffed, and patrols continued into the surrounding jungle, despite the increasing risk of disease and exhaustion. The persistence of these practices reflected the deeply ingrained culture of obedience, loyalty, and honor within the Imperial Japanese Army. Yet these efforts could not alter the strategic reality. Rabaul was no longer a tool of Japanese power, but a monument to its limitations. The Americans, for their part, continued to advance elsewhere in the theater, using the Leapfrog strategy to seize strategic islands and airfields while leaving Rabaul untouched. Each successful landing, airfield construction, or naval base further reinforced the isolation of the fortress. The strategy allowed the Allies to project power efficiently, reduce casualties, and accelerate the timeline of the broader Pacific campaign. The fortress that had once dominated Japanese planning became a footnote, a symbol of strategic foresight that the Japanese could not counter without incurring unacceptable risk. Historically, the campaign of bypass and isolation at Rabaul became a case study in operational art and industrial warfare. It demonstrated that victory does not always require direct confrontation, that strategic advantage can be gained by controlling the conditions under which the enemy operates, rather than by defeating him in battle. The campaign also revealed the profound psychological consequences of being rendered irrelevant by strategy. Soldiers and officers trained for engagement found themselves immobilized, their skills, courage, and preparation unable to influence the outcome of the war. The experience underscored a critical lesson. In modern, industrialized warfare, even the strongest fortress and the bravest garrison can be neutralized by the patient, methodical application of maneuver, supply, and air-sea superiority. For Japanese officers who survived the war, the lessons of Rabaul were bitter yet instructive. Captain Masahiro Tanaka reflected decades later, "We believed in the certainty of fortification, in the mathematics of supply, in the courage of our men. Yet the enemy moved around us, unchallenged, unhurried, and we were left to watch." It was not defeat in the conventional sense, but a defeat of assumptions, of doctrine, and ultimately of perception. Lieutenant Colonel Saito echoed this sentiment. "Our fortress was complete, yet powerless. Our men were strong, yet impotent. We were prisoners of our own preparations, trapped by the brilliance of an adversary we never met directly." In the final months of the Pacific War, Rabaul's garrison subsisted in silent endurance. Evacuation was impossible, reinforcement unlikely, and resupply minimal. The war ended with the fortress intact but irrelevant, a monument to strategic bypass. Soldiers and officers who had survived the ordeal returned home carrying the weight of both human suffering and institutional failure. Their diaries, logs, and testimonies became essential sources for historians, providing vivid insight into the intersection of human endurance, doctrine, and operational innovation. The legacy of Rabaul endures as a profound historical lesson. It is a reminder that warfare is not solely about bravery or fortification, but about the ability to shape the conditions of engagement. It demonstrates that industrial capacity, operational maneuver, and psychological foresight can render even the strongest positions irrelevant. For historians, the story of Rabaul offers insight into the interplay between material reality and human perception, between doctrine and adaptability, and between courage and strategic futility. In the end, Rabaul stands as a paradox, a fortress unbroken by bombs or shells, yet powerless to influence the war, a testament to the human capacity for endurance, yet a cautionary tale of the limits of preparation in the face of adaptive, resource-rich adversaries. It is a story of patience over aggression, maneuver over fortification, and strategy over raw strength. A final chapter in the Pacific War that illustrates the complex, often ironic realities of modern warfare and the profound human cost of being isolated not by defeat in battle, but by being made irrelevant in the eyes of history. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.